this. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Kedwin, and tonight I'll be talking about how to achieve unlimited security mode, or probably more accurately, how to enable security everywhere. So without further ado, here's the agenda for tonight. First, I'll be giving a brief overview on quote unquote the easy way, and then the hard way on how to reach unlimited security mode. And then maybe this is out of order, but we'll be going over what unlimited security mode actually is and how we might actually get there. Afterwards, I'll have some examples of the process I plan to introduce on how to get there. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. But first, here's the obligatory who am I slide. That's all there is about me. Moving on. Yeah, one more thing, actually. Before we get started, I have to make everyone aware of a few things. One, I'm just a student. I don't claim to be giving this talk as the definitive guide on how to secure any systems. Furthermore, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. So please don't take any of this talk as legal advice. Please consult your legal team because that's what you pay them for. Now, that is out of the way. So we can move on to what do we mean when we say security? Well, traditionally, right, we have the infamous kind of CIA triad. I'm sure most of you have heard of this before, but for those of you that haven't, the three main pillars are confidentiality, availability, integrity, and availability. Not authentication, not authorization, not. Confidentiality refers to keeping things secret, so that only the right people can access them. So you might ensure confidentiality with something like encryption or passwords or something of that nature. Integrity refers to something, or to making sure that the data or other things that you're trying to protect hasn't been tampered with, manipulated, modified, etc. And you might control or ensure this with something like a hash algorithm or signatures, or maybe even tamper evident seals, like if you're doing with a physical system. Lastly, availability refers to the being able to keep data, being able to access the data that or system on demand, if you want to. This is kind of a harder one to define how to implement because it sometimes is a function of confidentiality and integrity. I won't get into that too much, but yeah, moving on. So now we have a kind of working definition of security. I can explain the so-called easy way of achieving unlimited security mode. So if you use Java, well, if you use Java actually, if you use Java, there's a module for cryptography, but by default, its strength as far as like cryptographic strength is limited, right? Due to export controls, because I guess encryption is munitions. Therefore, to enable the unlimited strength cryptography, you just need to, unlimited strength cryptography, and therefore unlimited security. All we need to do is just say set the cryptographic strength policy to unlimited, and then you're done. Easy, right? So with Java 8, all you need to do is go to this link, download the policy file, and install it onto your system. And then there you go, unlimited security. Okay, cool. But if you develop with Java version 9 or higher, which maybe most people these days, or maybe not because Java 8 is still around, here's a one-liner. It's very easy. Security.set property, crypto policy unlimited, and you're done. That's it. You don't need to listen to the rest of my talk. Thanks for coming. Of course, it's really not that easy. Because remember on the previous slide, I covered three aspects, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If you just do this cryptography policy in unrestricted, unlimited nonsense, well, maybe not nonsense, but if you go the simple way, you're still missing two aspects, the integrity and the availability. And unfortunately, I don't have any other easy tools for you like this, so I guess you're going to have to go the hard way. What a shame. But before I get there, I have to make one thing abundantly clear. Crypto means cryptography. I don't mean cryptocurrency, and especially this is true for this talk and for almost certainly all the other talks you hear from this club, at the very least. Okay, sorry about that rant, but now we can finally move on to the hard way, or really the normal way, because we have established that the easy way, like I tried to propose to you, doesn't quite work. Okay, so here's the normal way, or hard way to get unlimited security mode. As you can see on the slide, we have a few things we have to consider, just a few. And this list, like I said earlier, is by no stretch of the imagination definitive, but it's a good starting point. And this is usually in the context of trying to secure some sort of application we're writing, using software that has hardware that's running somewhere, right? So starting from the basics, right? We have the physical aspect, which is either physical access or maybe physical hardware or whatever entity, like physical entities are present in the system. Next level up, we have the host level, which is either the hardware it's running on or maybe the operating system that you're using. A further step up from that could be the network layer. Like if your application is running on a network, that's what I'm talking about, like connecting to different computers or other systems or even services. And even higher than the network is the application, right, which runs on top of the host and may even require the network services. So, and then within this application layer, quote unquote layer, I guess, there are other things that you have to consider, right? These would be things such as programming language that the application was written in, maybe some libraries that were imported or not, and even the pipelines that were used to deploy and develop the application. So I kind of covered a few things that we might have to consider. So what is unlimited security mode actually? And how do we get there? Well, I don't know. Well, that's kind of not true, right? Because like I said, I don't claim to know everything about security, and I certainly don't know about the exact system you're trying to secure. And there's the fact that security is neither a state nor is it a process, right? I would like to claim that it's a process or a collection of processes. Like, sure, you might be secure today, but like that's a product of you having a process to secure the system and both the mindset to secure the system, right? Because if you didn't have either, I would argue that you wouldn't actually be secure. And so that kind of brings me to the next point, right? Security at its core is just risk management. Sure, you have threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, but what's the point? Like, why do we care? Right? It's almost because you have to protect something, right? Something's with the risk of being exposed, stolen, or destroyed, right? So therefore, everything we do for security in the name of security is to mitigate these outcomes, these adverse outcomes, right? Is just risk management. So how do we mitigate that risk? Well, this is kind of my main point for tonight, threat modeling. It's basically a fancy way of saying you need to ask the right questions, right? So to effectively manage risks, we have to ask the right questions such as, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Like, and the answer usually isn't to secure the system, unless you're actually doing security for security's sake, right? It's usually to support some sort of business goal, which we'll see later. Next, what are the risks associated with trying to achieve that goal? And then stuff like what are the vulnerabilities in the system? What are the threat vectors? And then finally, what's the probability of the vulnerability being exploited through that threat vector? And if it's exploited, what's the impact, as in severity? Yeah, so that's kind of a lot. So I kind of hopefully explain it a bit better in the next slide. And these are the definitions that I will be using to refer when I say these words, and the definitions I'll be using moving forward for the rest of the talk. So the system, this is the thing that we need to protect, right? And the threats are the dangers or potentials for dangers, right? For example, you have a password guessing attack or maybe a credential stuffing attack. Next, we have a vulnerability. This is the flaw in the system that allows the threat to manifest itself. So for example, I'm going to keep going with this password example. The vulnerability might be the weak password policy, right? Now, threats and vulnerabilities don't mean anything, as I'll argue, without a vector. And this is the means by which a threat can access the vulnerability to actually create some kind of danger, right? So for this weak password policy, and let's say we're trying to, this is a remote threat, without a vector of like RDP, remote login, such as RDP or SSH, you're not going to be able to get to this the threat, right? The password cracking or credential stuffing attack won't be able to manifest without this vector of remote login, SSH or RDP, right? So next, probability. How likely the vulnerability is, if it is exposed, is going to be exploited, right? So if I expose like SSH running on my network, but no one's scanning for it, what's the probability of it being exploited, right? And finally, we have severity, which is how great of an impact or how much damage can be caused if this vulnerability is exploited, right? Let's say I have a vulnerability or in the password, right? Let's example. Let's say this is I have weak password on my admin account. Severity is probably going to be greater than if this weak password is on, let's say, user nobody, for example, right? Okay, so I know I was kind of going on a bit for quite a bit. So are there any questions so far with what I've said or what I've claimed? Yeah, it looks like there are none in the chat. So I guess I'll be moving on to the next slide. Okay, so we know that things are vulnerable. How do we secure the system, right? So we mainly rely on these primary security controls, and these are generally tailored to a system, but they don't have to be system specific, I guess, or they don't have to be unique across systems, is what I'm saying, or across all systems, right? So I'm going to use the example of a firewall rules. Firewall rules certainly aren't unique, like isn't a unique control across all of the systems, but a firewall rule is definitely tailored to that system, right? As in, certain systems may need certain firewall rules, other ones don't, right? Let's say you need to allow HTTPS access to a server, but you don't need it for a workstation, right? So this is a kind of an example of a control that's not unique across all systems, but it's tailored to each system. So we have these primary controls, which are the main way we secure systems. But what happens to these? What happens when these controls fail? Well, that's why we have compensating controls, because these are what I'll usually refer to these as our secondary controls, and these are for when our primary controls fail, right? So or otherwise bypassed. Hopefully, these never have to be used as the result of a bypass or another exploit. But the main goal is to usually limit the amount of damage that can be caused, right? And I know I'm going to keep beating on this password example, but multi-factor authentication in my, for example, you could argue, is a compensating control for passwords, right? Because if someone stole your password, they still haven't had your second factor, hopefully. So the compensating control of your multi-factor authentication is able to control for when the case that your password is stolen or otherwise compromised, right? Or your password, like the password's bypassed. One thing that I should say though is that when selecting any controls, you should make sure that it is equally as secure as your other controls. So, for example, like if you're for a compensating control to, let's say, recover a password, I might consider like the multi-factor authentication token a valid compensating control, but I wouldn't consider something like security questions as a valid compensating control, because as they're currently, most people implement them, they are questions that are very generic, and you can search for the answers pretty easily, right? So that's a weak link, and that wouldn't be a good compensating control, even though it might be valid. So now we have the idea of controls and compensating controls, but how do you know that they actually work? And that leads me to accounting. Okay, fine. Auditing, fine. This is basically making sure that you're making sure that your controls are actually doing things, right? So how do you do that? Well, the easy way, right? Just log it, right? So you can log when they're being triggered, when they're not being triggered. But wait, how do you log where they're not being triggered? How do you know what you don't know? It's kind of hard, right? So luckily, there are certain people and companies you can hire to test these things for you, see if these things actually work. Now, these tests, often called penetration tests or red team exercises, are a good way to validate that your controls actually work, right? Because this is like the same idea of having a fresh set of eyes or fresh, I guess, hands on the keyboards, right? Making sure that your controls actually do the work that you're expecting it to. But what happens when you find something doesn't work the way you expect it to? Well, this brings me to the next point about patching, because I consider patching a collection of tasks for really configuration management, as in like if your software's out of date, you update the configuration on that system to have the most updated software version. Or let's say if you have a configuration flaw, let's say you don't like check for directory traversal in the web server. That's a configuration issue that you could do with control for with, or not control for, you could resolve with configuration management, like policies or other tools, right? So that's what I mean by patching. So yeah, accounting to make sure that your things work, and then patching to update really your systems when they don't. So that's all I have as far as like the way we kind of get there. And now I have a few examples that will hopefully make what I said a bit clearer if it wasn't clear enough. So our first example is you have the security information processing or sensitive information processing. So you have, let's say, a business application that's doing some processing some sensitive data. You can name anything that might be under this, like maybe PCI or HIPAA or whatever. It won't get into the specifics of those, but anyway, point being, you have some business logic that requires you to process and even store sensitive data. Now, that's the problem you're trying to solve, right? You have a business goal, you have a business application that's using this data, and you need to protect it. The system is usually the host computer or application or server or whatever service it's running on. And you have, let's say you have some threats. Maybe these are like someone walks into your data center and steals your host or the hard drive. Or maybe you have user accounts, and then there are there's passive reuse like on the system. Maybe you're worried about network attacks, right? People coming into the network, abusing the services and trying to just poking around to see what they can do. Vulnerabilities, maybe you have a lock on your front door that isn't the best. Maybe you have a configuration issue in your web server, or maybe you have a network architecture issue. Like maybe it's like a flat network versus, a network with clearly demarked or separated out or segmented network, I should say. The vectors that these vulnerabilities I'm out. The vectors that might allow these vulnerabilities to manifest. The front door or whatever door has a lock on it, because where there's a door, people can access it and bypass that and get into the data center and steal your drives or your servers or whatever. Maybe you have a network-based service, and that's another vector, right? So any HTTP, anything you're running that relies on listening on the network, that's a vector. And then, like I said, the intranet is a vector for delivering packets to your application, but at the same time, packets are packets, so evil packets don't have evil flag set. Otherwise, that'd be too easy. So yeah, the network internet is also a vector for things coming in and out of your application. And lastly, the cleaning staff, right? Because someone's going to clean your data center. They probably have a great amount of access to literally everything. So how do you, that's something that may not be, you might not consider, but keep in mind that there are, threat vectors come in all shapes and sizes. Now, how do you control for these vulnerabilities? Maybe you have a stronger lock on your front door. Well, that's just a lock. Locks can be bypassed. They can be picked. There's probably going to be a window. Windows can be smashed. So maybe that's one control, but you probably have another one. Regarding the weak passwords, maybe you have a password requirement. Maybe you have auditing, right? You have password requirements to require a certain strength or a certain quote unquote strength or complexity or whatever of password that will help control for the weak password case. As for the network, you might have a firewall to maybe filter traffic. You might segment your network so not everything can talk to everything. And maybe you have an intrusion prevention system that's maybe your firewall, or might be a separate appliance on your network. Whatever use case might be, that's another control that you can have in place to prevent intrusions or attacks from taking place. Obviously, not all of these are or 100% reliable or successful in blocking everything. So maybe you have, like I said, for the case where someone breaks in, maybe you have guards, armed guards even, right? Patrolling around, making sure that people who aren't supposed to be there are removed. Maybe you have certain different access controls on your doors, right? If you're paranoid about the network-based network mislogins, maybe you are so paranoid that you only allow administrative access through the direct console access. So someone has to go through the door, go through the guards, right? Have the appropriate credentials to be able to get to your console and sit down and do some admin work. Is it efficient? No, but it's compensating control, right? Yeah, okay, fine. I could have probably chose a better one, but you get my point. Maybe, and then for your intrusion prevention system, your IPS, if that gets bypassed, maybe you have an ITS on your network, a detection system, intrusion detection system on your network to control for the case. Maybe someone was able to bypass the IPS, but maybe you have a different vendor for your IDS so that they check for different things, right? So then maybe your IDS fires and you know that, hey, someone broke past my IDS, something's gone something's gone terribly, terribly wrong. This incident might be more more important, higher priority than some other incident that comes in. Obviously, right, a compensating control could be a pen test to make sure that your controls that you put in place actually do exist and are actually doing the work that you expect them to. Any questions on this example? Okay, moving on. Next problem, next example. You're writing some software, right? I don't know what the software is, but you're writing some software. It's required for business. It's mission critical for your business. So maybe you're just trying to get it done, right? Write some software. So what's the system that we need to protect? Generally, in this case, it's going to be the software that we're writing and whatever supporting systems that your software depends on. Maybe that's your database, maybe that's your middleware server, maybe that's your front end website that's serving it to you, your customers. Your threats may be arbitrary code execution, let's say, right? You have a system takeover, possibly. I don't know how you get that, but you have a system takeover threat. Maybe you have a threat of information leakage, maybe through certain either configurations or whatever. I don't know, right? But these are possible, any possible threat to your system, right? Now, vulnerabilities allow these threats to happen. Maybe it's a misconfiguration on your system that allows arbitrary code execution, or maybe you didn't sanitize input properly, right? Maybe you allow for script tags that aren't supposed to be there. Now you have arbitrary code execution in the form of cross-site scripting, right? Yeah, making sure it's not CS or cross-site request forgery, because that'd be embarrassing. Right, or poor input validation sanitation, right? Or maybe, yeah, so in that case, in the same vein, I could say that a successful directory traversal attack is a result of poor input sanitation. Anyway, so, but how do these things happen, right? Because if I'm saying that you don't have input validation, maybe then that vulnerability only exists if you're taking input, right? Sure, you have the threat of, let's say, cross-site scripting attacks on your system, but if you don't take any input, does that threat actually mean anything to you? Probably not. Well, yeah, probably not. So, like I said, if you have input fields, it could be a vector. If you're depending on the URL you visit your application with, maybe you take some parameter from there, right? If you have an API, that's definitely going to be public facing. That's by nature going to be a vector, because people are going to hit attack it, or people are going to use the API, and and maybe your public facing code repositories, right? That may be a vector for disclosing API keys or passwords or other things that shouldn't be in there, like data, like maybe customer data. Sure, these are possible vectors, like I said, and you might not have all of them, and not all of them may apply. So how do you control for that? Well, repository hooks to make sure that you're not pushing certain files that match certain criteria. Maybe like, make sure that the SSH keys or other API tokens aren't being pushed, or something. You have unit tests, maybe to test for to validate that input validation is actually happening, or you had some vulnerability in the past, and you make sure you don't actually bring that back in. So regression testing is kind of I would say, a subset of unit tests, but point being, you test your application, right, with your own unit tests. And then maybe you program with standardized security libraries that may be like hosted on your central corporate server with that have known good versions of software packages. Now, that should scare some of you, because centralized server with known good trusted vulnerability, or with known good software packages, that's a good place to stage a watering hole attack, right? I upload a malicious version of the software library, and now everyone's using it. Now all your things or all your package art belong to us, right? So controls are ways to ensure that you don't expose your system to risk, but you also have to make sure that your controls can be trusted and they themselves don't have risks in them. So yeah, kind of a interesting thing to be considering. Now, you have these primary controls, compensating controls. Let's say somehow your push, a push of some commit was able to get pushed to your repo repository, and now you have keys there. Or maybe someone was able to bypass a unit, or the unit test didn't trigger, or they didn't catch it. Maybe you have different tests in your continuous integration and continuous delivery tools, continuous integration and continuous delivery tools, CI/CD, to make sure that those tests actually get run per push or per release or whatever rules you have set. Maybe you have a pen test, like I said. Other people checking your code is probably a good thing. Maybe you have external companies do this, or maybe you have an internal team do this for you. Basically, something that someone who isn't you run through and test your code, test your application, whatever, to make sure that your controls that you put in place are actually in place and you didn't, miss something or override something inappropriately. And lastly, kind of in the pen test vein, but like the scanning tools, right? You have SAST, DAST, and IAST, which stand for static analysis scanning tool, dynamic analysis scanning tool, and interactive analysis scanning tool, or maybe A could be application rate analysis. The general idea is the same. I won't get into what those are because that's, but just know that there are tools that can help you scan for really whatever you define them for, right? So you could maybe scan for, like I said, someone was able to push a key. Maybe scan for keys, maybe scan for vulnerable like strings or passwords or whatever somewhere in your code that got past your repository hooks or maybe your unit tests or your standardized libraries, right? Questions on this example? Don't see any, so I'll move on. Oops. Yeah, next one. Next slide. There we go. Last one, right? Securing yourself, keeping yourself secure, keeping yourself safe. The problem you're trying to solve is to stay alive and stay secure. I'm going to go off the assumption that most of you want to keep living. If you don't, please seek help. Yeah, it's a serious matter. Yeah, keep your life, stay alive, keep yourself secure. The system obviously is you and everything you use daily, probably, and everything you're close to. Threats, maybe something, if someone tries to steal something from you, whether that be like a small petty thief, or corporations stealing your data, or maybe governments are spying on you and stealing your personal or invading your privacy, or maybe just random hackers on the internet want something from you to sell, right? Vulnerabilities might be something like your physical access control. Like, how do you control access to your devices, your property, your data, something like that. What services do you use? Would it be online or in person? And maybe even your physical condition, like your physical health, because maybe you need to run from someone that's trying to do you harm, right? Vectors, maybe it's your house. Your house has doors. Doors have locks. Locks can be bypassed. Windows can be smashed. Things can be stolen from your house. I don't know. I'm just listing things here. Maybe the devices and services you use are your vectors for people stealing stuff. People performing fingerprinting on you, stuff like that. The internet. Yeah. Funny thing. The internet is kind of dangerous, or it can be dangerous. Yeah, services are out there. Like I said, I think I've been beating this dead horse long enough. And finally, the pipe wrench, right? Someone whacks you over the head with a pipe wrench. They try to beat the password out of you, or maybe they just, something like that. Or they just, I don't even want to think of the possibilities, but you get my point, right? Someone can use stage a physical attack against you to extract what they want out of you. Yeah, that's not an ideal scenario, and I hope that never happens to any of you. But like I said, it's a possible vector, right? What controls might you put in place? Maybe you have device location tracking to make sure that your devices are within an expected area. Like you don't have, like, hey, why is my tablet computer suddenly on the other side of the country, or is it's moving, traveling east at 60 miles an hour? That's kind of strange. Maybe you have privacy tools, right? You have maybe like a webcam cover, hardware buttons for like mics or radio, like hardware kill switches, like as the buzzword, right? Like for Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or whatever, GPS. You could also have security tools like cameras and surveillance for your house, right, to make sure that you can spot intruders coming, and that you can call for appropriate help when you need it. Maybe use a VPN for your web browsing to help anonymize yourself, even if it doesn't provide you with the any additional military strength encryption or whatever they're using to market these days. Maybe use a password manager to keep your password secure so that you're not reusing passwords. And then to defeat the person that's trying to do you harm, maybe have an escort or like I said, guards, or you travel in groups, right, to make it yourself less of an easy target. Compensating controls might be auditing to make sure that your device is auditing like your password dumps to make sure that your email or your account, your email hasn't been exposed in a dump from like who knows what servers, but like have I been pwned is one such resource. Another compensating control might be like the CCPA or the GDPR, so that you can actually go after companies that might steal your data, or governments, actually maybe not the government, but at least corporations that are trying to steal, sell, or otherwise monetize your data, or without your consent. Like I said earlier, multi-factor authentication is a possible compensating control for your passwords, right, in case they're stolen, or they're been leaked or cracked or otherwise. You could use a secure operating system. I won't name any names here because if you know me, you know me. And finally, exercise. Yeah, exercise is a compensating control. Who knew? Now, depending on the kind of person you are, exercise will feel like bitter medicine at first. Speaking from deep experience here. Because keep in mind that the generator your life depends on requires physical effort to operate. Exercise is non-optional. So with that being said, here are a few things. Here are the two main things that I wanted you to take away from this talk. First, unlimited security mode depends on two main things. One is the system that you're trying to protect and whatever you're trying to achieve. And second, you asking the right questions. So with that being said, are there any questions?